Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. It's good to be back with you, Fred, talking about real science on Friday.
That's right. And we're talking about the science of global warming, a.k.a. now it's called climate change. And Doug,
Yes.
I mentioned last week, and I have it right here on my phone. So it's gaslighting, and it's this new millennial term. They love to come up with these goofy terms, and then I have to look them up. And what are you talking about, gaslighting? It's a form of psychological manipulation in which the abuser attempts to sow self-doubt and confusion in their victim's mind. That sounds like the climate crisis that Dr. Paul Homan was talking about last week. And his talk last week was fantastic. It gives you a really good perspective on what's really going on with climate change. Because, everybody believes in climate change, right? That's why they changed it.
Yeah.
That's why they changed the term from like global warming to climate change. Because who can dispute climate change? So we were just about ready to talk about how water vapor from this volcano under the ocean, I think Hunga Tonga, maybe I'm saying that right or wrong. I don't know.
Well, I think there's another Tonga or another Hunga in there, but you're really close. Yeah. It's awesome.
Well, to help with that, Dr. Paul Homan was just about ready to get into Hunga Tonga Bunga, whatever. So welcome back to Real Science Radio, Dr. Paul Homan.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, Fred and Doug, for having me.
So let's hear about Hunga Tonga Hunga Hai Pai.
Yeah, you have to abbreviate it. It should come up with a nice little acronym. But I'll just call it the Hunga Tonga Volcano that erupted on January 15th, 22. If you're joining us and you weren't with us last week, we spent the whole first show talking about Earth's energy balance. And really what we're talking about is the energy coming in versus energy going out. And I had been showing this graph that is very complicated, showing the incoming and outgoing as measured by NASA satellites. And we spent some time talking about how in 2015 we saw this, what I would say, natural shift in how much sunlight was being reflected in our planet and how much infrared was being released. And again, the takeaway was, if this was all the warming, which I'm saying we have been warming, was only due to greenhouse gases, you would not see the variation in this graph in all these variables. But what you do see is the natural changes that dwarf the man-caused changes. And at the very end of the graph, you could see these sharp spikes and drops in the amount of infrared energy. So infrared was being released from our planet in what we call a positive anomaly, or more than normal. And all of a sudden, last year, it nosedived, and we have a possible explanation for that. Mm-hmm. That is the Hunga Tonga volcano that spewed just gigantic amounts, something like 10% of the entire Earth's water vapor into the atmosphere. So in other words, we increased the Earth's water vapor by 10% in a single event. Now, water vapor will slowly work its way out, but something of that magnitude that is completely natural obviously is going to have effect on the weather and the climate.
And I was going to say, my understanding, would it make things warmer? Because, one of the news articles I read in prep for the show is that the Earth, or this last summer, was our hottest summer on record.
It was. And we'll get into that data in subsequent shows, but yes, it was one of the warmest, and I think it was due to all this water vapor released, also in an active sun cycle, and we're in El Nino. All three things, all natural, are in a warm phase right now, so it's not shocking. Mm-hmm. And maybe you can have me back in a year, but I would say a year from now, we're going to be cooler because we won't be in the warm phase of all three of these things. The sun will be in a cooler phase. El Nino will slowly turn to La Nina. And unless we have more Hunga Tonga volcanoes, will be way less water vapor in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But there's a good article linked there by NASA.gov and the Joint Propulsion Lab about how much water vapor was actually released back in 2022, potentially explaining our warming and some of the weather events this past summer.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely we'll have you back. So, it reminds me.
Flag the tape. flag the tape. We're going to hold you to
Yeah, we
this,
are.
Doctor.
All right,
Yeah.
I made a prediction, and
Yes, and we like
it's a risky
predictions.
business, but there you go. That's true of all theories, right? A good theory should be able to make predictions.
Absolutely.
There you
The
go.
hard currency of science is predictions. I'm guessing that the secular media won't jump onto global cooling like they did back in the 70s. But maybe if it happens long enough, they'll say, oh, we were wrong about global warming. It's global cooling. So now we got to, I don't know what they would change in our appliances and what cars they try to make us drive. But, I don't think my Dodge Ram truck is putting out water vapor, but I don't know. Anyways, Dr. Homan.
Well, I'll just pause there, and actually it is. That's an inconvenient fact that the byproduct of combustion is both CO2 and water vapor. And that's a great segue as we've been talking about greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are gases that don't absorb sunlight or radiation from the sun, but the sunlight heats the ground and the earth radiates out the long wave energy, the infrared radiation. And these gases, like water vapor, like carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide and ozone, they absorb this energy and they act as if a blanket. As we covered in our last show, if you didn't have this blanket of greenhouse gases, the earth would be too cold for life. So if we look at the amount of water vapor on the planet, water vapor, as most those that made it through at least fifth grade science know, it's variable. We call it humidity. Water can change phases from gas, water vapor, to liquid, water, to ice, solids. And so it's always changing in the hydrological cycle. So if more is locked up in water versus ice versus water vapor or the gas, that's going to impact our climate. So water vapor is not constant with time, nor is it constant with location. We know that here in Colorado. I keep having to drink water because it's fairly dry here as compared to maybe going down to Panama or Colombia down in the tropics. It would be very humid there. But if you look at water vapor, on average, it's about 2% of our atmosphere. And I'm going to translate that into parts per million, but 2% is 20,000 parts per million. Okay.
20,000. Okay.
20,000 parts per million. And we got to put that in comparison to these other greenhouse gases that they keep wanting to regulate. So yes, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of combustion. And the main theory behind global warming and climate change is that since the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, we started burning fossil fuels in mass for our cars and trains and power plants. That would be, gas and diesel and jet fuel and coal. And that has, around 1900, we were about 300 parts per million for CO2. And we've increased that to roughly 400 parts per million over the last about the last century. And so the question in all of this debate is that increase enough to cause issues in our climate? Is going from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million enough of an impact? And the short answer to me, as I'm going to show you, is no, for several reasons. One, the data shows it, that I just showed you in the graph, that the natural forcings are larger. But two, water vapor to 20,000 parts per million. In the tropics, water vapor can get as high as 9 or 10%. What would that be? That'd be 100,000 parts per million.
Wow.
Compared still to just to 40 parts per million.
Yep.
That's that whole blanket analogy we talked about, as pulling more and more blankets of CO2. How does that going to impact warming if you're sitting already at 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 parts per million? And then when you made your intro to the last show, your talk about methane. Methane's at 1.7 parts per million.
Boy, just a fraction.
Wait,
1.7.
Okay.
And yet they
Wow.
make such a big deal out of methane. I mean, that was the lead headline last week on Science, I think sciencenews.org.
Yeah. and
How
we'll
they
get
have to
into it.
deal with the methane problem, cows burping and whatnot.
Yes. Now, before we go on, gentlemen, you've both now used the term they, and the
ominous they.
left. The left always says that we're conspiracy theorists and we're crazy because we use the word they. So I want to assign the term they to a specific person right now so that everyone knows that we're not crazy. Gretchen Whitmer is the governor of the state of Michigan. She just signed legislation to completely eliminate the fossil fuel industry in the state of Michigan by the year 2040. She signed something that she believes is going to be a law. So when we say they, we're not crazy. Gretchen is there. Thank you. I just wanted to make that clear.
I'm pretty sure here in Colorado we've got something similar, and I only know that because I have a relative who works for public service, and they have something. I thought it was even by 2030 that they had to get rid of like coal burning plants and other means like that. That's just going to really damage the economy. So there's consequences behind this whole climate crisis that we are facing.
Well, and here's the big deal. I'm going to show you why I think they concentrate so much on carbon dioxide and methane. So I made a graph, and it graphs, the average water vapor. Then again, this is average, it can go higher, it can go lower, but 20,000 parts per million, carbon dioxide 400, methane 1.7. And on the graph, that means that water vapor, just by volume of gases, we haven't talked yet about the radiative intensity of how they absorb, makes up 98% of the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere on average. Carbon dioxide is 2%. And I couldn't even get my graph to say all the others sum together to anything more than 0%. And that's where methane would fall. But yet, this is a graph I'm showing now of what ABC News published. The graph says this is the distribution of greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere. It says carbon dioxide is clearly the majority. And then you could see nitrous oxide, methane at 13%. But the only way you can get methane to 13% out of the zero category is to completely ignore water vapor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fake news.
And well, thanks for those who are following along. That's my headline for this graph. This is fake news. I'm a meteorologist. It's impossible to predict the weather without paying very careful attention to what water vapor does. I mean, that's why they report it on the news every day. Humidity.
Right.
And it's not just ABC News. This is a graph showing from Weather Underground. That's their simple, here's the incoming versus the outgoing. And it says the greenhouse effect is CO2 and other greenhouse gases that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere. That's not accurate. Water vapor is the leading term by far here. And it's not just media, it's our government. This is a graph put out by the EPA. Checked, it's up there on their website as of yesterday. And it's very similar to the ABC News graph. And it says overview of greenhouse gas emissions. And they play a little semantics game here. And they go, oh, well, we can ignore water vapor because water vapor is not an emission. Well, if we want to get back to it, I think we talked about this already, Fred. When you breathe out CO2 and water vapor. That's your breath that you see.
Whammy.
So if you're going to count in your car in a cold day, what you see coming out, kind of the smoke or steam coming out of the back of your car, your tailpipe on a cold day, that's not CO2. There is CO2 coming out, but that cloud is a little condensation from the water vapor condensing back into a water in a cold environment. That's water vapor being released by burning fossil fuels. So if you're going to count CO2 as an emission, as from burning of fossil fuels, why are they not counting water vapor?
Yeah.
And now, we're suddenly getting into conspiratorial theories, but I have their reason is that it's because CO2 is a forcing mechanism in the climate. It's what drives climate, and water vapor is a feedback or a response. And we'll get into that into a later radio show or at the talk. on Friday night at Littleton Baptist Church.
Yeah, just a reminder.
But,
Dr. Homan will be at Littleton Baptist Church tonight. If you're in Denver, December 8th tonight, Dr. Paul Homan. Go to youngearth.org and he'll be there. And I just want to also remind the audience that Dr. Homan, he was the director. He recently retired as the Director of Meteorology at the United States Air Force Academy. So this is it's such an honor to have you talking about this, Dr. Homan.
Well, we talk about sometimes as government accountability. This is a webpage paid for by your tax dollars. And the title of it is Overview of Greenhouse Gases. Yet it doesn't even mention the greenhouse gas that counts for 98% or more of the greenhouse volume of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I'm a meteorologist, so I'm proud to say that if you go to the National Weather Service or NOAA, the National Centers for Environmental Information, on their webpage, they actually do mention water vapor. Maybe the EPA should go across the other part of Washington, D.C. and talk to some of the meteorologists. And it says here, water vapor is the most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Why is addressed first? But they do bite into they said its results and its concentrations result of climate feedbacks or response. But then they state, and I highlighted that in red on the video, but as of yet, it's fairly poorly measured and understood. Mm-hmm. So when you hear people say things like the science is settled, well, here's a bunch of scientists saying the thing that drives our weather, water vapor, we don't even understand. It's hard to model. My PhD is in numerical modeling of atmospheric phenomena. And I could tell you, it's so hard to get the water vapor humidity correct in these models to get weather forecast right for 2, 3, 4 days from now, let alone climate forecast for 100 years from now. So we're going to talk more about the role of water vapor and contrast it with CO2. So not only is there more of it and more abundant, we have to look at, and this gets a little physicsy and sciencey, of what is absorbed and where is it absorbed in our atmosphere. So hopefully most of our listeners are familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum. You could just think of it as a straight line left to right. And on the far left, we have a really, really high energy particles, gamma rays, X-rays, UV light. Then we get to visible light, which is what our sun produces. And then we get to longer wavelengths, lower energies, infrared, radar, TV, FM, AM radio, those sorts of things. But if we want to look at these greenhouse gases, we have to look at what types of energy and where these greenhouse gases absorb. And so when you look at the total absorption of the atmosphere of infrared energy, which would be the right-hand side of this graph that I'm putting up for those in our viewing audience, infrared is what the Earth is emitting. You could see that the total absorption of the atmosphere is primarily absorbed by, drum roll please, water vapor.
That big elephant in the room, the 98% water vapor.
The 98%.
That people act like isn't there.
And so here's the argument somebody might make is that one molecule of methane has a higher radiative properties. It'll absorb better at certain wavelengths than water vapor, 1-to-1. And that is a true statement. However, methane, as you can see, and carbon dioxide, they don't absorb across large portions of the spectrum. They only absorb in very particular wavelengths. And I've highlighted the two portions for the viewing audience. The shaded gray is basically the total greenhouse effect. And what I've circled in yellow is the only parts that could possibly be controlled through CO2. And I don't even highlight methane. And the reason I don't highlight methane is you look at methane, and methane only absorbs infrared energy at a very particular wavelength, a very narrow band. And water vapor already absorbs there 100% of the time.
Wow.
So, and an analogy that I put forth for, I know this is Real Science Radio, we have a lot of scientists on here, but if you're not a scientist, if you're shooting a rifle into 100 feet of concrete and the round is being stopped every single time, in other words, it's being absorbed, is it going to change if I put a piece of paper? Is the net effect going to change? What if I put a ream of paper or a pallet of paper? I put it in front of the concrete or behind the concrete or embed it. The net effect doesn't change. And so, yes, there might be some more methane floating around, and a photon of energy might be absorbed by methane at that wavelength before water vapor, but it doesn't change anything. It was already, if it wasn't going to be absorbed by that methane, a millisecond later, it was going to be absorbed by water vapor. It had no chance of escaping straight out into space. It was 100% of the time going to be absorbed already. And that's why, capturing methane, I think, is a fool's errand. Carbon dioxide does have an absorption band right in the middle of the Earth's emissions of infrared, but water vapor already absorbs there roughly 50% of the time. So its concentration there is small. And then a lobe that they like to talk about a lot, where carbon dioxide absorbs and water vapor does not, that is highlighted a little bit to the left in the circle, the yellow circle on our graph. But if you look, that's out on the edge of Earth's emission. In other words, Earth doesn't emit much energy at that wavelength at all, so there's not much to absorb. Yeah. So the net takeaway is not only is water vapor the most abundant, on top of that, it absorbs in a much wider spectrum and band across the infrared window that the Earth emits from, which makes it by far, without any question, the most important greenhouse gas. Yet the UN, in their Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report, mentioned CO2 119 times in their executive summary. I think back in 2014 is the one I'm quoting. And they mentioned water vapor 0 times. Wow. Why might you think that is, gentlemen?
Yeah.
Well,
there's an agenda. Go ahead, Doug.
I really can't tell you, because I remember driving down the road listening to Rush Limbaugh, who you mentioned on last week's show, in 2009, when he laid out this whole IPCC, the Climate Research Unit, the University of East Anglia, Professor Phil Jones. I remember thinking, this all sounds like made-up names for a really bad PBS miniseries, where he basically exposed the whole hoax with the made-up numbers and the email secrecy. I thought this was all... This is 2009, and you're quoting from 2014. I'm just not sure how they've managed to keep propping this thing up, but they have. Yeah, certainly more now than before.
And I find remarkable that so what was, and Doug and I talk about this all the time. It's great having guys like you, Dr. Homan, on the show, because we learn so much too. Because my way to address climate change when I debate it with friends or coworkers or whoever is, like you had this whistleblower for the NIST about how they were using selective data on their ocean sensors and this and that. And that's a good argument in itself, but I wasn't aware of this huge elephant in the room that you've exposed today for our listening and viewing audience, is this water vapor, where it's 98%. And even when you talk about the absorption and that you've gone through, you look at methane. Methane is so negligible that whenever you read a science report on methane causing global warming, you got to know, if you listen to our show, that's fake news. If you hear them talking about carbon dioxide, it has a little bit more of an effect than methane, but it too falls under fake news, because they're not telling you about the elephant in the room of water vapor. And that's what the science shows, and they're ignoring it. They're not telling us about it.
As we started out the show, we see the effects measured by our satellites in the last year and a half from all that water vapor that got put into the atmosphere by the Hunga Tonga volcano. We don't see on that time scale the effects of CO2, and certainly not methane. And to drive this point home even more, I have what seems like a fairly complicated graph, but it shows the absorption bands of just CO2 and methane at different concentrations across different frequencies or wavelengths. And as we've introduced, the gases don't absorb at every wavelength. And so what this graph shows, they have CO2, since that's the big one we always try to go after. It shows the absorption of CO2 at 0 parts per million, which again, we don't want, or we'd be frozen. 400 parts per million, which is where we're at today. That's the black line. And then it shows, this was done by Dr. Will Happer, a PhD from Princeton. He worked under both the Bush, Clinton, and Trump administrations. He's been trusted by lots of our leadership. He produced this graph, and he shows a doubling of CO2, and that would be the red line on the graph. This is that idea that we talked about where once you add one blanket, you get a little warmer when you're cold in the winter. You maybe add a second. By the time you're adding the third and the fourth, the effects are almost negligible. And you could see the difference between the black line and the red line. There's almost no difference with a doubling of CO2. If CO2 just can't absorb that much more, between 400 and 800 parts per million, why are we trying to ruin economies, spend trillions of dollars to keep us around 400 parts per million? And then the graph below is the same idea with methane, 0 parts per million, 1.8, which is about where we're at, and a doubling to 3.6. Guys, I could put on my glasses, but I can barely see any of the 3.6 because, again, the changes are negligible.
Yeah. And so, you're speaking to why then are we spending billions of dollars on this? And it reminded me of when my son Ryan was he was taking a political science class at CSU. And one of the questions the professor asked at the very start of the semester, and this is one of those classes with a big auditorium, and I'm sure they've probably got something similar at the Air Force Academy. I believe. Did you teach there, Dr. Homan? Were you the
director? I taught there as a professor for 7 years, and finished as the Director of Meteorology there.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, anyways, the professor asked, is there anybody in the room that has a problem with spending billions of dollars on climate change? And maybe back then they called it global warming before they had, that's a whole nother story in itself, why they changed it to climate change. But anyways, my son and a friend of his that went to the same Christian high school, Cornerstone Christian Academy. They looked around the room, nobody's raising their hand. And, Ryan and his friend both look at each other and they raise their hands. And the professor calls them and asks, okay, why do you think, can you explain your position? And Ryan said, well, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about climate change. So why are we going to wreck an economy and spend billions of dollars on something that we don't fully understand? I mean, he gave an answer something similar to that. I would just love if these professors in these colleges would show this data, this elephant in the room, but they're not going to, because like I think all of us believe, it's a spiritual warfare. So it's up to us, shows like Real Science Radio and Dr. Paul Homan giving his talks on this across the country. We got to get this information out. And it's just another spiritual attack. It's going to make lives more miserable by the economic impact that they're trying to shove down our throats with just all the different things that they're putting on us, burdens they're going to put on us. It's really unbelievable. And I know the impact coming from the relative of mine who's pretty high up in public service company here in Colorado.
Well, Fred, if we have time, if I could close out with why should we even care as a Christian? Photons, infrared energy, sunlight. This is, mentioned, this is a worldview. This is a moral issue. It's a battle for truth. If you come out tonight, I'll show you even more data with temperature data sets, with models, with other interesting data about wildfires and glaciers and tornadoes and hurricanes. But if we could end, I really want to focus on the Bible for a few minutes and why Christians should care. If we want to honor God, we want to have a worldview that's consistent with Him and the Bible. And the Bible warns us in many places to be wary of false teachers and those that would lead us away from God. And He tells us to destroy. It doesn't use little, put on your white gloves language. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against what? The knowledge of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to
Yeah.
take this out of context. I mean, the number one thing the world attacks is the Godhead, personhood, life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But this whole movement starts with there is no God.
Exactly.
And so if they could control what you think, and as Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. Another word for empty deceit is just lies. Jesus says, I came to testify to the truth. Yes, the truth about himself, but we can use science to find truth. And we've seen a lot of empty deceit. So how does the Bible present that we as humankind should interact with God's creation? And does man have a role in that? And there's not time, but you could turn to Genesis chapter 2, specifically verses 7 and 15, and you see that our creation, our earth, the universe is an intentional, robust design by a creator.
Mm-hmm.
He tells us to work it. Like think of that like farming or bringing forth fruit, working the ground. He does tell us to keep it, to guard it and protect it. We don't like dirty water. I shared a story about that. We don't like dirty air. And I'm going to show something with that here in just a second. But it doesn't mean to not use the resources God gave us. And then God gives man in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 31, God gives man dominion over the earth. And he says, use this earth in order to bring glory to himself. And if I could just real quickly contrast that with the modern environmental movement, I mean, I've worked in universities. I've talked at a lot of universities. I'm not talking about any individual person, but in our secular humanist society, their number one assumption is there is no God.
Yep.
And then they also they think of the earth, it's one big cosmic accident. It happened because of random chance, and therefore it is very fragile, and they must protect it at all costs. And therefore humans are the enemy of nature. If a human walks across a field and bends a blade of grass or steps on a bug, somehow humans then are the enemy of nature because it is fragile. Guys, what this leads to, the Bible talks about this leads to the worship of the creation rather than the creator. I'll just say that one more time. People worship the creation rather than the creator. That's called pantheism. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 25, Paul speaks to this. It says, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the creator.
Yes.
And we're always also reminded in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so as I study this really, when we talk, as simple as, well, why do they highlight CO2 and why do they not highlight water vapor? Gentlemen, I think it's because fundamentally they can't control God, but they want to pretend like they can.
Mm-hmm.
Elsewhere, in scripture, it says that, men hide from God because their hearts and their deeds are evil. Yes. Light has come into the world. It's Christmas time, and we know that light came in the incarnation of Jesus, the Son of God, as a little baby. And so rather than accept that they might be responsible to an ultimate creator, they design a system that tries to remind them on a daily basis and create their own truth to try to deny the deity of God. And at the bottom of line, when we talk about creation, nature untouched by humans, not using its resources, is just not a biblical idea.
Amen, brother. Preach it. I couldn't even, I got to tell you, Dr. Homan, your talk tonight at Littleton Baptist, Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship, the past two shows, this, for me anyway, eclipses the IPCC hoax revelation that I heard 15 years ago. I mean, because you go to the scripture and you really bring it all together for what's real and for what really matters and for what's going to last out into eternity. And the fact that what you've said, what you've presented it should put to bed the whole climate crisis. That pales in comparison to the spiritual reality that you've opened anyone who's willing to look. You've opened their eyes to it. Thank you. God bless you. It's been just my honor to be on the air with you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate the opportunity. And, each of us just have a role of searching for truth. Mm-hmm. And if we would all open our eyes a little bit, I think we would, see we're being lied to a lot in many areas. But the number one lie is that there's not a creator.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
we are going to stand before that creator. The heavens are telling the glory of God. And you pretty much have to shut your eyes in order to ignore that.
Yeah. His invisible attributes are clearly seen. So those who deny it are without excuse. They won't have, I was told this by this person and that. No, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. So Dr. Homan, I couldn't say it better than what Doug said. This provides the type of information we need on climate change and the whole argument for climate crisis, a much better way to approach the argument with actual real science. So I'd like to remind our audience that now that it's Christmas season and towards the end of the year, if you could help us out at rsr.org/store, there's all kinds of great materials you can get. You could subscribe to one of our shows, or just provide a one-time donation, a recurring donation. And also we want to give a shout out to Colorado Right to Life. That's coloradorighttolife.org, CRTL.org. And they've got a great campaign going on right now with billboards across the state of Colorado, strategic locations, warning pregnant women who are heading into our state, because we're a state that's a destination for abortion. And so if you want to help in that battle, please go to CRTL.org. You can have a tax-deductible donation with them. They're a fantastic organization, and we are real proud of our partnership with them. So again, Dr. Homan, I can't wait to see the rest of your more of your stuff tonight at Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship, and that's at youngearth.org to find more details. There'll also be a video of your talk from there. So for Doug McBurney and Dr. Paul Homan, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.